Good evening, everyone. Well, here we are. It's 2021, so I'd like to welcome everybody into the new year and hope that your new year is going better than 2020. There's been some pretty interesting news lately, and I want to invite you all tonight to take an opportunity to just take a big, deep breath. We're all excited to have you with us. This will be the first talk on our series for the winter term for the Sound Studies Institute. And so I just thank everyone for joining us this evening for this talk. I'm really excited about it. I want to just, first of all, acknowledge, so we're at the University of Alberta. The Sound Studies Institute is located in Edmonton, Alberta, which is on Treaty 6 territory. And so we want to acknowledge that as part of that, we're part of a gathering place that has hosted and been here for diverse Indigenous people throughout the last 1,000 years or more, a gathering place for Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Inuit, and many others. And SSI is committed to ensuring that those histories and languages and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community, and we want to welcome you all here tonight. For those who are here for the first time, the Sound Studies Institute, or SSI as we say here, is a research institute here at the University of Alberta that supports research and creative activity that centralize sound in any way. And we're pretty open to what that means. We're very interdisciplinary, and we're very proud of that fact. Our researchers, we have a number of affiliated researchers here at the university who work collaboratively, and we try to make space for that to happen, to discover new areas of convergent inquiry, benefit from just collective working together to make interesting things happen, and try to just provide a kind of philosophical and physical locus for sharing and exploring and celebrating. This is just a continuation of that tonight, and excited to be to see you all here. I want to thank Oliver Rossier, Tom Merklinger, and Gail Mandrick, who are a part of my team here. They really make things go, and I'm grateful to them. Just to let everyone know, generally speaking, when we have been hosting these events, which I still feel like we're new at this, but I guess we've been doing this for a while, and have found that these have been really wonderful events. We do sort of mute you by default as you come in, so you may have noticed that, but that doesn't mean that we don't or aren't interested in having dialogue with you and having questions and things like that. So when we get to the end of the talk, we'll be opening that up so that people can ask questions, and there may even be some participation this evening as well, invited by the speaker, who I'm very excited to introduce, Stephanie Loveless. But first, I'm going to pass the baton over to Natalie Loveless, who is going to be co-hosting this as part of the Art Activism and Global Crisis series of the collab. And so we're really happy to be co-presenting this talk tonight with the collab. And I will now introduce Natalie Loveless, and she can say a few words about the collab. So Natalie, please take it away.
Thank you, Scott. So my name is Natalie Loveless. I'm also coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, which is in central Alberta, currently known as Edmonton, where I am an associate professor in the Department of Art and Design. And as Scott mentioned, I'm the director of the Research, Creation, and Social Justice Collaboratory. And with Scott and Bo Coleman and Jillian Harvey and Sean Caulfield, one of the co-directors of the Faculty of Arts signature area in research creation. So before Scott officially introduces Stephanie, I want to say that, the collab is really honored to be co-presenting her talk today as part of the Art Activism and Global Crisis series, along with the Sound Studies Institute speaker series. A couple of things about that speaker series. I'm going to put a link to it in the chat for anyone who is interested. It's funded by the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada, and in each of the presentations in the series, an artist or a scholar or an artist, scholar, artist who is interested in modest ephemeral forms that are often performance-based, has been invited to present. And our interest really is in these kinds of modest ephemeral performance-based forms as much as they help engender new forms of political consciousness. So that's one of the wagers of the series, and something that we're thinking about through each of the presentations and the workshops. Thinking about the ways that these kind of often overlooked, really modest forms can challenge the intertwined heteropatriarchal, petrocapitalist, settler colonial perspectives that are so central to the intersecting global crises that we are facing today. So it's in this context that I'm really looking forward to Stephanie's talk. And if anyone is confused by our shared last names, yes, she is indeed not only my colleague, but my sister. And I will hand the reins back to Scott to introduce her.
Great, thanks for that. I want to say, first of all, something I forgot to mention in my opening, but the music that you were hearing when you all came in this evening was some music from the great and unfortunately late composer Pauline Oliveros, who, as you're going to find out, Stephanie Loveless worked with and currently is the director of the Deep Listening Center at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which interestingly enough is also a place where I worked before, years ago before I moved to Canada, and was lucky enough to work with Pauline in those early days. And one thing that I have to say that I love about Stephanie's talk tonight, Deep Listening Across Distance, was as Pauline became older and many of us who were close to her began speaking to her in I don't know, just honest ways about life and the world and growing old and everything else. Pauline always was very certain that once she left this earth, she would still be with us and still be listening and to be listening for her. So I just want to say that's a nice thing to be thinking about in this moment in 2021 while the world is in turmoil. So thanks so much to Stephanie for coming. And Stephanie, I hope you forgive me, but I'm actually going to read your bio because it's so lovely. It's so great the way it's written. I love it. So I'm just going to read that bio. Stephanie Loveless is a sound and media artist whose research centers on listening and vocal embodiment. Her recent projects include a mobile web app for geo-located listening and sound works that channel the voices of plants, animals, and musical divas. She has studied with pioneering composers such as Pauline Oliveros, with whom she completed a certificate in deep listening, Hildegard Westerkamp as a founding member of the Vancouver Soundwalk Collective, and Diamanda Galás. Currently, she teaches courses on deep listening and ecologically-oriented sound art at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York, where she also serves as the director of the Center for Deep Listening. And so I hope we can all give her a virtual round of applause and welcome her, and I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. That was such a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much for invoking Pauline's presence. Yeah, I kind of needed that. You can hear me okay? Yes, I got a thumbs up? Okay, wonderful. So yeah, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Natalie, and thank you that everyone who's here. And I should probably share my screen at this point. Let me do that. And begin. Okay, I'm going to presume that you can see the title of my talk, and if not, that somebody will pop up and tell me. So I am going to be talking to you today about listening across distance in the context of the historical moment in which we're living. Each of us listens differently from our own histories, identities, bodies, and positions. And so I want to begin by sharing some of the positions from which I listen. I listen here today as a sister, a student, a teacher, a facilitator, a settler of primarily Jewish and European descent, a mother, a dual citizen of Canada and the US, a Quebecois, and an artist. I listen from traditional Haudenosaunee and Mohican territories in what's presently known as Albany, New York, in the capital of New York State. I'm listening from my home, which sits about half a mile west of the Hudson River. Like many of us, I've been working from my home in online forms like this since the beginning of the pandemic. And in this context, I've become increasingly interested in the range of ways that deep listening, a creative practice of listening attention that I've studied and that I champion, has explored and expressed through imagination, collaboration, and technological innovation, the desire to connect across different registers of distance. So as we begin here, I'd like to invite you to participate in a listening, breathing, and sounding exercise with me. So we can't see each other and you won't be able to hear each other. So I'm inviting you to perform a kind of private exercise in which we will all nevertheless be listening and sounding together. So I'll talk you through a series of instructions, but please participate in whatever way feels best for you. So I'd like you to start by just moving your body maybe, or shifting in whatever ways might be necessary for you to get into a really kind of comfortable, relaxed position. And as you do this, you can also just lower your gaze a bit, soften your gaze, or close your eyes even. And now I'd like you to notice your own breathing. You might observe the way that it moves your body as you breathe. You might notice any sounds that it makes. And now, as you continue to breathe, I'd like you to see if you can allow your vocal cords to just vibrate with your breath. Just let your vocal cords vibrate in whatever way comes naturally as you gradually introduce your voice to your breath. Again, in whatever way it naturally occurs. You might find that this results in sighing sounds, maybe grumbling, maybe something else. And if you like, you might just now at the end begin to let the intensity of that sounding, of that vibrating, to increase very gradually. And then maybe we can end with a synchronous inhalation and exhalation. So what we were just practicing in this exercise is the beginning of a sonic meditation for group performance called Teach Yourself to Fly. It is the very first piece in a collection of scores called Sonic Meditations that was published in 1974 by Pauline Oliveros, the American experimental and electronic music pioneer, or as she once described herself, a two-legged human being, female, lesbian, musician, composer, among other things. Before I talk more about what deep listening is, how I came to it, and why I think it is a particularly generative, gosh, what's going on with my slides? Thank you. So, sorry about that. Before I talk more about what deep listening is, how I came to it, and why I think it is a particularly generative mode of engagement now, I'd like to share some moments in my own experience of deep listening as I studied and worked with Pauline from 2006 to her death in 2016, experiences that solidified my commitment to this practice. I am at my first deep listening retreat in 2006. I am on a silent listening walk, and we are walking so slowly that the bottoms of our feet become ears. I've been silent since the night before, following the instructions given by Ione, Pauline's partner in life and in listening, in order to help us shift to a listening-oriented attentiveness and to listening in dreams. In the single most psychedelic experience of my life, not aided by hallucinogens, as we wind along the mountain path, I hear, or more correctly feel, a cluster of boulders speaking, slowly humming their own temporality. 2. Some months after returning to Vancouver from that first retreat, I experienced a heightened moment of what Pauline called global or inclusive listening, a state of attending to multiple sonic threads at once, of allowing what is usually perceived as distinct or perceptually ranked in hierarchies of importance to be threaded together as an expanded state of attention, an interwoven composition. This is at an outdoor folk festival, and I'm aware of the band on stage, but my attention is equally attuned to the shifting tones of human conversation, to clattering objects, car stereos, bird calls, distant traffic, and the sound of my own thoughts. As my listening attention expands, I experience a profound sense of being held by, bounded up in, the world around me. 3. A few years later, working on my deep listening certification, I am practicing listening meditation daily. My experience with these listening meditations is distinct from previous experiments with meditation through counting breath or focusing on a flickering candle, in which I would fight my thoughts and hope for eventual transcendence. Here, instead, a focus on listening tunes me into the vibrations of my environment as expressed through sound, allowing me to experience the world around me in the sympathetic vibrations of my body, my eardrums, my skin, my flesh, my bones. It also allows me to experience this interconnection not as a violation of those boundaries that keep my insides safe from the outside, but as a grounding and enlivening experience of the reality that is already so. 4. This last memory is actually a polyphony of memories, of performing sonic meditations with others, in which voices, trained and untrained, are heard and amplified by one another, touching each other as they meet and meld in shared acoustic space. Through my participation in countless performances of sonic meditations, led by Pauline, led by others, led by myself, I've experienced deep listening as a practice that not only develops sonic and beyond the sonic awareness, but in which, through improvisatory performance, attention and awareness move into the world through collaborative and relational sonic responses. Since 2006, deep listening practices have been central in my own artwork, as well as since 2015 in my job as a faculty member at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I teach deep listening to mostly engineering undergrads. In July of 2020, I also took on the directorship of the Center for Deep Listening at Rensselaer. Pauline established the center in 2014 to steward the legacy of deep listening through directing deep listening certification programs, sponsoring workshops and retreats in a range of community settings, pedagogical development, and continued research. While an honor for me, this directorship is an administrative role. It's both maintenance labor and a labor of love, but it doesn't make me an expert in listening or an authority on Pauline's life and work. Among the deep listening community are brilliant composers, performers, improvisers, teachers, facilitators, organizers, and community activists. I know some of them are here today, and all of whom mobilize deep listening in their own way. I say all of this to underscore that I come to deep listening and to this talk, not as an expert, but as a deeply invested participant. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to think about deep listening in relation to the intersecting crises, political, social, health, ecological, that we're living through. This talk is happening against the backdrop of political upheaval, racial reckoning, and continued environmental devastation. It's also happening in the context of profound social isolation, in which digital connection has become a lifeline, while at the same time, the ways that it can never replace fleshy encounters has been laid bare. This talk then is a personal essay that considers the sensory and relational modes cultivated by deep listening, alongside Pauline's long and varied exploration of creative forms of connection across distance, and some final musings on how practices of listening might be mobilized in our present historical moment. So, what is deep listening? I often heard Pauline say to workshop participants that she didn't really know what deep listening was herself, and that we should just go ahead and create it ourselves, together. That said, in the liner notes to her 1990 album Crone Music, Pauline defined deep listening as listening to everything that there is to hear at all times and reminding yourself when you're not listening. Listening is something that Pauline differentiated from hearing. Hearing is always happening. With no earlids, we hear in 360 degrees, 24 hours a day. While hearing happens automatically, listening is what happens when we bring conscious attention to what we are hearing. So what Pauline called deep listening is the practice of bringing conscious listening attention to your surroundings as fully and continually as you can, which she considered a way of increasing creativity and connection with all forms of life. Through Pauline's scores and performances, in her workshops, retreats on the certification program, and in her undergraduate courses at Mills College and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, she taught and embodied deep listening as a practice that includes attention to one's sonic environment, but also listening through the body, composition and improvisation, and listening in dreams. Beyond literal sonic awareness, listening here is an orientation. And it's one that I'll argue encourages an ethical orientation that operates outside of the extractive heteropatriarchal structures that are at the root of our current social, political, and ecological crises. I first encountered deep listening as a young-ish woman, finding her way in what was then, and remains to a significant degree, a male-dominated field of experimental and electronic music. Deep listening spoke to me as a practice that emerged from female-led collaborative sonic research. In the late 1960s, Pauline initiated an exclusively female-identified research collective, the Femme Ensemble, with whom she spent a year workshopping collaborative listening and sounding activities that were independent from the patriarchal structures of what she termed the sexist forms of music that were available to her. The results of this research, published as The Sonic Meditations in 1971 and 1974, took the form of 25 instruction scores for community sounding that are participatory, inclusive, non-hierarchical, and that invite profound sensorial and relational reorientation. Recently, I've been reading and listening with the work of Dylan Robinson, who was actually the last speaker in the Art, Activism, and Global Crisis series. Robinson is an Indigenous Stello scholar whose work wrestles with, among other things, how settlers might work to, quote, reorient our practices of listening and find new allied forms of non-colonial settler listening. In his beautiful book, Hungry Listening, Resonant Theory for Indigenous Sound Studies, Robinson articulates the hunger of settler listening as an orientation that is extractive, accumulative, and instrumentalizing. He does this while at the same time thinking through and centering Indigenous listening practices. He also issues a provocation for those of us working in the field of sound studies to begin thinking critically about our own listening positionalities, that is, the intersecting positionalities we commonly call identities that shape how we listen in the world. This inspired my attempt at the beginning of this talk to begin to name some of my own listening positionalities. In the conclusion to his book, Robinson creates the context for a generative exchange, an excerpt of which is on the slide, between two settler colleagues, Deborah Wong and Ellen Waterman, who are of Asian American and white settler Canadian identities, respectively. These are colleagues with whom he was already in conversation around issues of sonic performance, embodiment, and Indigenous sovereignty. In taking up Robinson's invitation to grapple as settlers with what a practice of decolonial settler listening might entail, Wong and Waterman spent some time considering deep listening as a practice with the potential to move participants beyond what Robinson terms settler-listener fixations, expressed in the fevered need to extract, to consume, to use, to know. This suggestion of deep listening as a tool for decolonial listening is exciting to me. It is also a complex issue and one that I really welcome discussion of in the Q&A and beyond. In my understanding, Pauline's work was not overtly decolonial. She was in fact critiqued for appropriation of Indigenous imagery in her work at different times, and like many of her colleagues and contemporaries in the 20th century musical avant-garde from John Cage onwards, her work was profoundly influenced by her study of Eastern philosophical practices. All of that said, I do believe that deep listening encourages an orientation that is aligned not only with feminism, but with an ethics of decolonial listening. Precisely how this is so perhaps marks an important set of next steps in the critical discourse of deep listening, as modeled by Wong and Waterman, and as I hope to develop in future research. Pauline's work encompassed an enormous range of forms, media, and technology, but in beginning to think through the ethics of deep listening, I want to stay a while longer with her sonic meditation instruction scores, both those published in 1974 and those composed after. In the book, Sounding Out, Pauline Oliveros and Lesbian Musicality, Martha Mokas points to how the ethical relations embodied in the sonic meditations resonate with the aims of, and in fact, emerged in the context of, feminist consciousness-raising groups of the 1970s. She notes the following resonances: non-dualism, non-hierarchic structure, acknowledging the importance of material reality, listening and giving attention to the voices of women, dialogic nature, and respect for the agency and limitations of others. She goes on to say that, as a form of feminist consciousness raising, the sonic meditations, quote, offer participants provocative opportunities to question dominant notions of music, talent, sound, ability, and musical authority. I'd like to delve into these qualities a bit more and to explore how they might resonate with decolonial practices. The first quality is that of basic accessibility. In the context of Western musical tradition, scores in the sonic meditations are radically accessible. Like the Fluxus text scores of composers like Lamont Young and Yoko Ono, they are notated not with notes on a page, but with words. They also don't require any instruments, just some kind of body and some kind of voice to participate in them. These factors open up the scores to allow for participation regardless of musical background. As an important side note, this commitment to accessibility is also powerfully expressed in Pauline's work in the development of AUMI, the Adaptive Use Musical Instrument, a software interface designed to be accessible to those with limited mobility. Along with many of her contemporaries in the mid-20th century, Pauline wanted to break down inherited hierarchies between composer, performer, and audience. She wrote in correspondence in 1973, I am calling into question that whole symptom of active performer, passive audience, a perfectly sexist operation. So in contrast to this sexist operation, in the sonic meditations, composerly authority is distributed among its performers, whose listening and sounding decisions shape the final form of the piece. Take, for example, the tuning meditation, perhaps Pauline's most widely performed piece. Versions of the score were published in 1971, 1980, and finally, as the worldwide tuning meditation in 2007. In this piece, performers are instructed to alternate singing a long tone of their choice on one comfortable breath with reinforcing someone else's tone, ultimately tuning to as many different people in the group as possible. So pitches are selected from the mind's ear of each participant, while the duration of each note is dictated by what each performer deems a comfortable breath. All of the sonic meditations are designed to be fully participatory. There's no audience. All present are at once composer, performer, and audience, with and for each other. With no dedicated audience and active participation of all bodies present, the scores are inherently non-spectatorial. But beyond this, they are also co-constitutive or interdependent, which is to say that they are made up of, composed of, and composed by the participants. As in the tuning meditation, the sonic content of timbre, timing, rhythm, and pitch are all determined by the individual listening, voices, bodies, and decisions of each participant. Performers are invited to listen and respond to themselves, each other, and their surroundings, negotiating agency and surrender. Relationality and community negotiation are prioritized over any set goal or musical output. The beginning of each sonic meditation is marked by an intake of breath, and endings are left to emerge from subtle non-verbal negotiation via instructions like continue as long as possible or until all others are quiet. In this, they resist the regimentation of linear clock time, or what Mark Rifkin called settler time. Instead, they practice a sense of time that is conducted by the breath, listening, and response. I'm regularly struck by how, even in facilitating these scores with skeptical 19-year-old engineering students with no musical background, a clear moment, sometimes after 2 minutes of performance, sometimes after 10, always emerges in which we all become aware that the piece has now ended. One last quality of listening that I want to discuss that's developed in deep listening scores is that of receptive responsiveness, a listening attitude that perhaps most clearly operates otherwise from the hungry or fevered, extractive and instrumentalizing impulses of settler listening. As Deborah Wong explains in the conclusion of Robinson's book, in the sonic meditations, the listener is directed to wait and be quiet, not to search or seek. We are invited to release effort, desire, and expectation in favor of receptive attention that develops into relational response. This is deep listening as a practice of listening, a practice of attention, a practice of responsiveness. Taking as their material the patterns of attention with which we listen, these scores focus less on musical output than they do on collective experiencing, a collective that for Pauline included human, animal, artificial, or extraterrestrial sounds and subjectivities, or as she also put it, communication among all forms of life. Another listening memory. I'm sitting in on a session of an online deep listening intensive run by the Center for Deep Listening. Jane Rigler, one of the intensive facilitators, is leading a sonic meditation in which our ears become a microphone and then a listening beam. In my mind's ear, I hear the tiny scuttling of a distant beetle, and I can feel my flesh thrumming in vibrational empathy. It is an overwhelmingly intimate imaginative connection in which there is an opening to be touched intimately in a way that I will assert a looking exercise could never create. There is something I continue to believe about listening that allows us to access an experience of connection to the world around us that is both unique and undervalued. What deep listening mobilizes here in its responsive receptivity is the possibility of pausing an overemphasis on production and of allowing oneself to be marked by an other, whether animal, vegetable, mineral, or astral. This magic also resides for me in the simple fact that sound touches you across distance. We are caressed, massaged, held, or barraged by sound. We experience this in our everyday, in bass felt in the belly, in loud sounds vibrating a window pane, and the visceral response to a high-pitched squeak or fingers on a chalkboard. Listening is bound up in its surroundings in a way that both models and invites responsiveness and responsibility. In listening, we experience both our porousness and our connectivity in meaningful ways. And at this point, I am going to practice slowing down myself and pause this talk. So for this little pause, just feel free to take a breath again, to stretch, to move around a bit, or to rest your eyes. And I also invite you to expand your listening from the sound of my compressed Zoom voice to include the sounds of the room around you. The sounds of your own body's movements. And maybe any sounds that you can hear from outside of the walls where you are. Continuing. The theme of connecting across distance is expressed throughout Pauline's work poignantly, over a lifetime of exploring whatever technologies were available. In Some Sound Observations, Pauline writes, "When I was 32, I began to set signal generators beyond the range of hearing and to make electronic music from amplified combination tones. I felt like a witch capturing sounds from another realm." She goes on to tell of being accused in one electronic studio of practicing sorcery, and the director disconnecting line amplifiers to discourage her from continuing. In 1987, she began working with composer and technologist Scott Gresham Lancaster and several ham radio satellite operators to send first her own accordion playing, and eventually the voices of audience members to the moon, in order to listen back to its echo 2.5 seconds later. To me, these stories point to a passion for experiencing through sound connection beyond the everyday, beyond what we might call the limits of settler colonial hetero-patriarchal perception. An impulse that animates her early childhood tinkering with crystal and shortwave radio sets, through experiments with a wire recorder she received in 1947, and her first magnetic tape machine in 1953, to a lifetime of sonic exploration through her accordion, which she described as the amplification of my own lung, and in her research with electronic music, group improvisation, technological innovation, and even the supernatural. All of the scores and sonic meditations ask participants to extend their listening beyond their everyday. Several of them do this by explicitly calling on telepathic listening. In Pacific Tel, participants are asked to form mental sound images and send them to others in the group, while remaining sensitive to potential receipt of sound images from others, which they are then invited to sound out. Telepathic improvisation is a delightful score that reaches towards mental synchronicity between performers and an audience. First, by having performers of any instrumentation tune themselves to the audience by attempting to telepathically receive and then produce audience-imagined sounds. The performer's responsiveness to feedback from the audience on how successful or unsuccessful the transmission has been is what constitutes the instrument tuning portion of the piece. After tuning, performers disperse themselves throughout the audience and begin to play any long tones that they are mentally receiving. The third in this series of telepathic scores divides performers into groups that might be separated by a small distance or by, quote, thousands of miles or light years, in order to attempt what Pauline terms intergroup or interstellar telepathic transmission. I hear in these pieces sonic speculation into what Pauline would articulate in 1999 as quantum listening, which she defined as listening to more than one reality simultaneously. We might also think of quantum listening as listening beyond the edges of perception and understanding, the concept of listening in dreams that she would come to develop in tandem with her partner Ione, and a playful exploration of listening across distance that would be realized in a different form through her explorations of telepresence, which is a state of being present at a distance through telematic means, as Pauline explained in a 2014 talk at the Center for Advanced Study at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Telepathic means, of course, refer to the use of any telecommunication technology from radio to telephone to the internet. Some famous early examples of telematic performance in which distant collaborators are connected and able to perform together via electronic communication technology are Max Neuhaus's Public Supply from 1966, in which calls coming into the 10 telephones at the WBAI radio station in New York City were mixed, then transmitted over the airwaves, and Marianne Amishay's City Links, produced between 1967 and 1981, in which distant microphones were connected to installations, performances, and even private spaces using analog phone lines. In her talk in Illinois, Pauline offered a range of historical Western art music expressions of this impulse to think and compose across distances, from the antiphonal compositions of the Renaissance made for opposing choir lofts to German composer Stockhausen's compositions for distinctly spaced orchestras, to electronic composition that uses spatialized speaker arrays to create new senses of space. With characteristic equanimity, she responded to an audience member voicing their techno-skepticism about virtual collaboration by replying that her explorations were grounded in the technologies of the past 50 years and hopeful of all the technology of the future. Pauline's first large-scale telematic musical transmission in 1991 connected 6 cities via video telephone bridge. Organized by composer and performer Joe Catalano, the co-located concert began with a 20-minute broadcast from each location at which friends had been invited to perform, and ended with all 6 cities improvising together through phone lines that, due to technological limitations, only transmitted the loudest signals, and video transmission that at that time was limited to 1 still image every 5 seconds. All conditions that Pauline embraced as constituting the formal boundaries of the piece. When internet transmissions became possible in the late 1990s with an 8-second latency, Pauline, in collaboration with 7 other artists, performed Loose Ends Connections, a networked improvisatory piece that played out between Mills College in California and 2 locations, Harvest Works and Morton Street Studio in New York City. Here again, in Pauline's words, quote, "The 8-second latency became a structural element of the improvisation." Of listening in to the sound of distance as expressed in time latency in both compositional antiphony and telematic collaboration, in addition to asserting that she loved it, she said, "I am convinced we are all made of time delays." Moving from a musical to a pedagogical embrace of technological limits and possibilities, in 2001, Pauline began teaching her deep listening class at Mills College in San Francisco, California, from the comfort of her home in upstate New York. Before the release of Skype in 2003, she made this work with Yahoo Video Messenger, coupled with a telephone conference call, in order to teach virtually via both video and decent audio. The early 2000s were also the period in which Pauline began collaborating, improvising, and making music in Second Life through her avatar, Free Noise, or Free No Yes. There she is, enjoying a sound installation by a Dutch sculptor in a virtual gondola with Ione. In 2006, she founded the Tintinabulate Ensemble, a multimedia ensemble of which I was briefly a member, made up of graduate students and faculty at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, dedicated to online composition, improvisation, and performance. In co-located rehearsals and performances with like-minded groups like Chris Chaffe's Soundwire Ensemble at Stanford University in California, The ensemble explored the limits and possibilities of co-located performance from both musical and technological points of view. In 2013, wanting to make her deep listening certification program, which until then was conducted via in-person retreats in idyllic locations, more financially and logistically accessible, she began to move the certification program online. Today, the Center for Deep Listening offers its 3-month intensives online to international cohorts of students, taught by a group of facilitators who have learned how to build intimate spaces of group exploration and collaboration over Zoom. They do this by allowing for and trusting the possibility of authentic virtual connection, the ability to touch each other at a distance that sound itself models so beautifully, while also consistently turning students' attention to their own environments, their own bodies, their own voices and movements and dreams. Finally, in 2020, 4 years after Pauline's death, and shortly after the current pandemic sent countries worldwide into lockdown, Ione, Claire Chase, and Raquel Klein led a series of performances of the worldwide tuning meditation on Zoom, with over 4,600 audience participants over 5 performances. And I will play a brief excerpt of this for you now. These events were extremely moving for participants and pointed to how artists can find new ways of using and subverting the technologies of our everyday and mobilizing the spirit of Pauline's work as a way of touching each other through distances great and small. While Pauline was a techno-utopian, I am a techno-skeptic, but Pauline's work inspires me to feel the value of what feminist science studies scholar Donna Haraway terms staying with the trouble of our increasingly virtual worlds. What are some of the ways we can do this? Rather than leaving corporate interests to determine the playing field of virtual connection, it seems imperative to think through the cultures of encounter that we want to nourish in this time of Zoom meetings and FaceTime family gatherings. So, what can deep listening offer in terms of reorienting how we do our virtual connections? How, as we engage in online gatherings, directing our attentions to screens and covering our ears with headphones, can we resist becoming increasingly atomized through practices of listening? Can we include practices of proprioceptive sensing of our surroundings, of the soundscapes and histories of the different lands from which we connect? How can we listen for the ecologies or the voices of the telecommunication technologies themselves that are connecting us now? Taking one last cue from Dylan Robinson, who asks, might we envision subtler virtual realities that, rather than expanding the possibilities for perception, radically limit it instead? I am reminded to consider the foundations that undergird the patrio-capitalistic, heterosexist drive for continued expansion of possibilities, for limitless and instantaneous connection that our virtual meetings are an expression of. What might it mean then to fold into these new structures of online meetings, courses, workshops, and family gatherings, places of refusal, of turning to the hyper-local, and allowing ourselves to feel our inability to be in more than one place at once. Spaces for gardens and neighbors and love letters and shortwave radio and correspondence courses. Without succumbing to romanticism or nostalgia, we can acknowledge that there is ecological and philosophical urgency in insisting on limits, on non-productivity, on radical non-mobility. Beyond creative interventions into existing technologies, deep listening as a philosophical framework offers generative practices for slowing down, for listening with our surroundings, with ever-present, with ever-evolving post-human technologies, and with each other. What might such attitudes of listening provide at this time? Thank you.
Yay, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And what we're going to do now is just, if you need to leave at 8 o'clock, please feel free to do that. And we are so happy you joined us tonight. And for those who want to stick around and ask some questions, we'll stay on until 8:30 to facilitate that. I can start because I always have a lot of questions. Maybe I'll ask you, Stephanie, just a little bit about your experience. I have to admit that this is partly a selfish question because I'm curious about the current climate of deep listening and the deep listening center at RPI. And just for those of you who don't know, RPI is a really interesting place because unlike Mills College, where Pauline did a lot of her early teaching, RPI is not really known as an art school. It's an engineering school, in fact. And however, it also has a history of having one of the first MFA programs in North America that was integrated arts, and meaning that the whole purpose of the program was not to declare a discipline, but to come and work with people in multiple disciplines. So it has that history, which is really interesting. And when I was there, the undergraduate program, which was primarily, as Stephanie pointed out, a lot of engineering students, that program sort of fed its, we made a lot of, or I shouldn't say we, but the university made a lot of money off of the sort of tech bubble. And that enabled us to really generate more interest in the MFA program, which kind of took off during that time. So it's a really interesting place to do this kind of work. And I was always so impressed at Pauline's ability to somehow grab the attention of these. I'm thinking specifically about the undergraduate population there. The graduate population was totally different because they were artists. But yeah, I'm just curious about how generally the students this resonates with them or not, and what kind of strategies you use, and maybe if you have any fun stories to tell about that. But anyway,
fun stories. I don't know about that, but yes, the majority of my classes are these kind of like majority engineering student cohorts, often first years. And so there's definitely a curve that is perhaps a comfort curve or an openness curve, right? So the semester begins with a lot of like arms crossed and like, and then it's a matter of my strategy is to be very gradual with them. We begin with like small things and kind of tricking them into making some sounds and doing some movement and feeling more comfortable as a group, and also making it really clear that anybody can kind of step out of any exercise or do it in their own way at any time. I find that helps a lot. And yeah, and they love it. They love I think, so they say, but it provides a great contrast to the other kinds of courses that they're taking. Of course, it's really different in the part of the brain that it's exercising. And so I think they experience it as just like a relief in a sense. But I hope that it also provides an important counterpoint and a balance, and that it can inform the work that they then go on to do in the world. I don't know if that answered.
Yeah, that's great.
That's part of your question. Yeah.
I see a question in the chat here. In what sense does, this is from Michael O'Driscoll, what sense does mediation factor into the ethics of listening? That is, how do the constitutive meditations, or mediations, I'm sorry, I'm misreading this, of analog and digital signals call for forms of listening different from face-to-face experiences? I hope do I need to reread that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm rereading it. How do the constitutive mediations of analog? Okay, I'm going to just read from the beginning. I was struck that I could hear the whoosh. Yes, you could hear the whoosh and the swirl of the Zoom connection. And so how does mediation factor in? That's just a wonderful question that I 100% don't have an answer for, except for that, I mean, surely it does, right? You know, which is exactly this is exactly where my thinking is right now, right? So how can we, so yes, it influences the way that we can listen, right? Even just on a really material, what things sound like form, but also in other ways. And yet what is mediating our listening or our methods of connecting is often, you know, invisibilized or inaudibleized. And I think it's really important to try to foreground that and bring attention to it and include it in our listening. Yeah, but it's really and very beautifully put question as well. And I don't know if you want to unmute Michael to see if he wants to say anything more. In what sense does the mediation factor into the ethics? Yeah, there's a lot in this question, right? So when we're thinking about the ethics, then, you know, what are the ecologies of these different technologies and how do we engage with them? And what kinds of attention do they normally kind of evoke or invoke from us?
Thank you, Stephanie. That was amazing. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah,
Thanks for the answer. And wow, what a wonderful talk. I'm completely like sparked and enchanted and all kinds of things. So I think what I'm thinking about is so the notion of telephony, right? So voices from a distance is a fascinating one, and it assumes a kind of presence, and it practices a kind of presence that I can very much embrace as a concept. But at the same time, you know, when we're listening to recordings from the distant past, or when we're experiencing a kind of vocal distance that doesn't convey that presence, it creates a sense of a kind of a break in intersubjective relationships that maybe is never there or is always there in the first place. And so for me, the counterpart to the tele is the media, right? And how does one think about that in relationship to, and that's kind of where it took me. And I do a lot of work on magnetic sound recording, and so that's
awesome
where that comes from. But thank you. Your answer was fantastic, and there are other great questions awaiting you. You don't have to continue.
Great. Thank you.
Speaking of which, so the next question I believe is Sydney. I don't know if you want to speak to this over the microphone, but I can read it and I'll read the full thing this time. Sorry, this isn't fully formed, she says, but I am interested in the idea of refusal as you describe it as a functional and revolutionary opposite to the colonial settler constitution of borders. I think visually, so the image that comes to mind is the landscape is defined and limited by Dominion Land Survey, which is so evident from the air, but also through fences, township and range roads, etc.? What a great question.
So refusal in relation to borders. I would love to hear. Can we unmute Sydney as well?
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Oh, great. Hi. Hey.
Hello, Scott. Hi, Natalie. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about border theory lately and settler positionality in relationship to land and landscape, and actually having embodied relationship with land in a way that surmounts those structures that are imposed on all of us. Some of us can privilege from it where others cannot. So I've always thought of those ideas, those structures as borders to push against. But your talk just so eloquently flipped that whole thing on its ear for me tonight. I'm just, the brain is all over the place. So that idea of refusal as a positive moment, and also as a way to surmount structural inequalities. And those impositions and definitions.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's like, if the focus of the refusal is not what it is that we're refusing, but rather what we're listening for, right?
Yes. If the focus of the refusal is an opening up rather than closing in.
And then it becomes so natural. Why would there be a border right in the middle of this lake? That makes so much sense.
And then it gets flipped on its ear.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And so the physical borders no longer have the power that they could have.
That's very inspiring. Thank you.
You are very inspiring. Thank you for a fabulous talk. And my brain just exploded. Officially, we're done.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Sydney. It was great. Here's a really great question from Sarayan, who I know is here. I don't see him on his video on, but he says, thanks for a lovely and provocative talk. He's first wondering if the worldwide tuning meditation, well, he says it's so magical and wondering if it's available on YouTube. And I was going to say, I have a bootleg recording of the one that she did in New York in 2007, because I was on foot and I went there and I recorded it from a distance and it was beautiful. But anyway, you said the other question is, he says, you ended your talk by addressing the politics of time. Did Pauline have more to say about when occasions of tuning meditations could happen? I'm wondering about the calendar politics that this enables. And so, Ryan, feel free to chime in. You're unmuted now, I see.
I am just beginning by putting a link to that particular iteration of the worldwide tuning meditation on Zoom. So there's that. I think that I'm not sure what is meant by the calendar politics. I have not heard, and maybe somebody else in the room has. I never heard her speak of particular times that it would be appropriate or inappropriate to do the tuning meditation. It was performed like very often in very different contexts, and always participatory, right? So even if it was in a concert hall and, after a like, I don't know, quartet, the audience would be led to engage. And I do know that Lawrence University, Lawrence Conservatory of Music, which is an affiliate of the Center for Deep Listening at Rensselaer, have been folding or using listening meditations in religious services funerals, just like really bringing it into these moments when really being and feeling together as a community is what is needed. And I just think that that is so beautiful. But in terms of calendar, I don't know. I think she would probably say it is for, you know, anyone at any time.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Let's see, we have Jana next. Thank you for a great talk, Stephanie. Just hope you might be able to speak to this based on your own work or your understanding of Oliveros. What are the dangers or possibilities of projecting preconceived ideas of what we hear?
Well, preconceived ideas of what we hear. So here, I'm not sure if we're talking about what one would expect to hear in contrast to what is present, or ideas about what is heard. But I would say that in either case, the danger is really simply not being present to what is there, right? You know, in listening as in with all things.
Yeah. I'll speak to that too. Just
yeah, I was just going to say.
Well, I mean, I don't know why it makes me think of this, but the very first time I did a deep listening exercise with Pauline, which I don't even remember when it was a long time ago. But I struggled because I have tinnitus. I've had it all my life, and obviously it's getting worse. But I remember having this moment during that when I realized that I needed to actually work extra hard to not hear what I was hearing and to hear to move past that. And I struggled with it a bit, and I eventually found a way to live with it. But it was just really interesting. I don't know if this doesn't quite get to the question, but that's what it made me think of when I saw it. So, yeah.
There's too much pressure to form an articulate question at this time of the evening. Stephanie, wow, I have pages of notes beside me from your talk. Thank you so much for that. I have thousands of questions. But I am going to bring the intellectual caliber of my the questions down a bit here. So bear with me. When in those moments where you referenced a few moments where you're talking with engineering students and orienting them, I just want to focus in on that. Are you moving beyond just the single sensory engagement, this sort of focus on the singular sense of listening, to get into that deeper embodiment of the plurality of senses, or thinking with our senses, not just about our senses? And I find it ironic, this morning I was in a conference presenting on sensory ethnography. So to bookend my day with your talk, I'm like, I wish it had started the other way.
Great. Yeah, the answer is yes. Yeah, I think I tried to convey this in my talk, but I might not have done it enough. That so this is what I mean when I talk about listening as an orientation or an approach, right? So it's kind of based in sonic experience. But for me, and again, for me, it is really a way of approaching the world, you know, through the sensorium. And for Pauline and the way that she taught deep listening in the different ways that she did, it wasn't a single sense. Movement was very much included. Dreams were very much included. I don't think that she focused very much on the visual. And I think that visual is like pretty covered, like we're good there. But you know, maybe not, but so yeah. And then with the students, we definitely do, we do movement exercises. We talk about listening through the body, right? That very famous score of Pauline's to, you know, walk so slowly that the bottoms of your feet become ear. I believe there were things that she said that I use about like the whole body as an ear. I don't know if that, answers.
Thanks for that. Let's see. Next we have Aura, who says, I was wondering if, thanks you, and says, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about micro or macro ways of deep listening that can play a role in healing communication rifts or connecting polarizing ideas that seem to be increasingly prevalent today. Oh boy, and threatening to tear societies apart. That's a great question. And and actually for everyone who is invited to unmute, if you wouldn't mind also just, if you don't have to, but if you turn your video on too, then I will actually see you, because at the moment it's hard to see who's unmuted and who isn't, but please feel free to pipe in if you would like, Aura.
That's really great, Aura. Thank you.
Hi, nice to see you again. Yeah. If you want me
Hi.
to say anything more of that, I can.
No, that's pretty clear. That's pretty clear.
Okay.
And that's pretty huge. And so I don't have a set answer. I don't know. This is something that I think about. Certainly, there are ways that listening can very much, and this kind of like receptive listening that we might actually call them compassionate listening, right, can make a huge difference, apparently, based on studies of what they call deep canvassing, which is distinct from making like quick calls to voters, where you actually have just engaged open conversations that again don't have some kind of set goal of what the output will be, but where you're just listening and responding to one another. They say that those kinds of conversations can actually like really shift hearts and minds. So in terms of what I think are the orientations of listening, I would say, yes. And then also my other answer, and this is just kind of something that I feel, well, and it's something, Pauline, wrote about and spoke about, kind of creativity as being really an innate part of being a human being, that everybody should have access to. This is like part of what fueled her, the way that she cared so much about accessibility in music in so many ways. And I believe that too. And I believe that when people have access to their kind of full creative selves and they're connected to their bodies and they are able to make sound, like for me, there's something even just so beautiful about being able to sound with your voice, and it doesn't matter what it sounds like. And it can be all kind of creaky cracky, and it can like not hit the notes that it aimed for, but that's your voice, and you're allowing it to be in the world and be with others. I think that if everybody were doing these kinds of pieces as a part of broader culture, that that we'd be in a different place.
Beautiful answer. Thank you. Yeah, that resonates a lot with me. Maybe just your authenticity, right? To just have your voice be real. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aura. JR, oh, I see JR has popped up here too. You can unmute yourself if you like, but she's asking about thoughts about deep listening and language. Does language get in the way or interrupt or inform listening?
Again, these are like all such really wonderful, provocative questions. Thank you, everybody. I have some really ill-formed thoughts about deep listening and language. Deep listening is interesting in that it's actually based on language, right? On like receiving kind of instructions, whether verbal instructions, kind of pedagogically, if you're involved in a deep listening workshop, or the instructions of the scores, right? These are all language. And yet the output is usually more non-verbal, right? And my work as well tends to be non-verbal. And I've been beginning to think recently that that I'm really interested in kind of exploring this space between the non-verbal soundings that that move me so much, and actual like conversation, you know, with words between people in community, and if there's some kind of things that can be teased out or explored in between, right? So not here, but over here. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
I guess I'm wondering a little bit, and it may not be your area of focus or interest at all, but I'm thinking about field listening, you know, like a kind of listening in space and in place. And when we're trying, which is something I'm trying to do right now, is I'm trying to listen to things, but I don't know what they're called. And I'm constantly fighting with this, you know, compulsion to name and resistance to naming, and just what is that sound. But language is part of how I record and remember. So that struggle with language, the impetus of it is also its downfall. Is like,
I totally get it. I totally get it. And it's a beautiful tension for myself. When I'm experiencing a listening meditation, often there's this wonderful sense of not needing to name things, right? And really just experiencing the sound kind of as it is, or as I experience it, you know, and at the same time, you know, naming is one of the ways that we actually connect with things in the world, right? And give value to things, and actually can develop a more like granular sense of the world, right? Like whether you're just, it's a bird song, or whether you're like, you know, actually the names of the birds, you can name them and you hear their calls, and maybe you come to know some of them individually. And so yeah, so just yes. And maybe it's a matter of allowing for both, right? And really just like patting your brain like on the back, like, yes, this is a wonderful thing, and we're going to do this now. And then now we're going to practice this other kind of maybe listening, you know, without names, because, right, names allow us to see each other, right? We all like to be called by name. But they're all little labels as well.
It makes me think of her sense of humor and the way in which she sometimes addressed these things in her journals. I don't forget which article or journal it was, but one of my favorite quotes is where she's describing how she was listening to a bulldozer that had just crashed through the wall while she was eating lunch in her apartment. And then a couple paragraphs later, at the very end of this thing, she says, "I would love to amplify the sound of a bulldozing."
Yes. She was the biggest punner that I have ever met. So yes, words.
So good.
But then the way that you can play with them and make them mean other things, and maybe they're not always what they seem. Yeah, thank you.
Let's see here. Michael Frost. Says, thank you for the presentation. I appreciate the new framework that I can use to help me explain the challenges I live with. Please, could you explain what impact deep listening practices could have on the concept of informed consent in healthcare?
So I don't know if this is coming from a Canadian or an American, but so informed consent, as I understand it, is when you say, you know, yes, I know that you're planning to do XYZ to me. I know, and it is okay, you may do it, kind of with a like, therefore I won't sue you later because you did that. Is that right?
Yes, that's kind of what I'm getting at. I find I'm spending a lot of time right now reflecting on these ideas as they relate to invisible disability and access to healthcare, and I was really moved by your presentation, and I'd just like to learn a little bit more about your thoughts on the idea of how you would see this concept intersecting with the ideas of informed consent and invisible disability in the healthcare space.
And can you speak just a little bit more about the connection between invisible disabilities and informed consent? And I think that would help me respond a bit more.
Specifically, the connection that I'm starting to sense in this way of thinking, this framework, would be ways of allowing those that the healthcare system right now doesn't judge as capable to make choices as being given ways through such practices to have relational capacity to make the ultimate choices about, yes, this is the kind of care I myself want, rather than this is the kind of care that someone acting on my behalf thinks is in my best interest for me.
Wow. So that's a really profound question, right? And so what just comes to mind for me as somebody who this is not my field at all, and I don't know anything, but is really just listening with those people as individuals. And when you do that, then there's an ability to maybe meet them in the place where they can, where a clear communication can go back and forth, right? And I guess that's both ways. And so that's really in that, and this has to do with the slowing down as well, right?
Yes.
With the speed of the system, the way people have to just move through, there isn't the space for that. I think it would be a wonderful, slow research project to try to explore that and maybe find some answers. And then your question also makes me think about, again, Pauline's techno utopianism, where it's and I wonder, is there some kind of app like the Almi app, that people are able to, engage with in ways that, again, meet them where they are. Yeah, so that's very thought-provoking. Sorry, I don't have more of an answer.
I will keep pondering, reflecting on, and exploring. Thank you for your ideas.
Great, thanks.
Great. I think getting close to 8:30, so we've got maybe one or two questions here. Donna is asking, she says, wonderful and thought-provoking talk. Stephanie, thank you. Are you teaching your classes online at this time? Any tips for making these concepts about listening come alive on a virtual platform? And I'll also just jump in with a related question here by Leah, who's asking also about suggestions for books or resources for listening vocal embodiment for singers and performers in particular.
Okay. Whoa.
Sorry, I didn't mean I grouped them.
You're like pedagogy. So I am teaching online. Okay, a few tips. So first of all, I've just changed the way that I'm teaching, dramatically, because my courses were really based on standing in a circle, sounding together, moving our bodies, and that kind of structure won't work. So instead, I'm leaning on the kind of one-to-many or solo or student-to-student interactions that are possible. So leading listening meditations at the beginning of every class, which is what I did before, but that's kind of easier to reproduce online. And then having students, giving students little assignments that have to do with ways of listening, right? Go out and listen, just sit somewhere, turn your phone off and listen for 10 minutes, and then write about it. Or, turn your phone off, take your earbuds out, and actually go on a walk without chatting with a friend. And so people having these individual experiences that shift the way that they're used to listening or being in the world, and then having students explore different things, find something that's meaningful for them, and then create an assignment for another student. So sort of, yeah, it's just a little bit less, it's the shape of the way that I'm able to introduce these ideas is different. And there's also a software that I haven't experimented with yet and whose name I can't remember, so this is very unhelpful. But it allows you, if you use it at the same time as Zoom, but mute yourself on Zoom and have your audio through that, you can actually have everybody be unmuted at the same time and really hear everybody at once. I've experienced this, but I haven't used it in the classroom setting yet. And if the name comes to me, that will be much more helpful, and I'll share it. And then,
well, I'm wary of the time, and I know a lot of people are here at other time zones, including Stephanie, and I know it's getting late back in Troy. I think you're in Troy, right? Or Albany. But I just want to thank everyone again for this coming to this event, and thank Stephanie for a wonderful, thought-provoking talk. And I hope we can go into our evening with some calmness. And I also just want to mention that the next talk on the SSI series will be on January 27th. We're going to have the great banjo performer Joe Dickey, who's going to be talking about the banjo and the physics of the banjo, and it's going to be really exciting. So I hope some of you will be able to come to that on Wednesday, January 27th. And thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. This has been really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.